Michael Wigglesworth, probably the third best known poet among the Puritans to our generation, but clearly the best known for his own era. As a matter of fact, this was a hugely popular work, The Day of Doom, and several other of his works. In fact, it was so popular that very few copies still remain. Now, usually you think, well, a few copies remain, it must not have been a very widely published book, but quite the contrary. In fact, it was so popular, most people who read it so often and so frequently, committing this thing to memory, in fact, that in point of fact, very few copies survived having been read so thoroughly. That's how incredibly popular it was. This was designed for mass public instruction so that the masses of Puritans would get what Wigglesworth, anyway, and the Puritan establishment thought was correct theology. And so it tries to work through several theological difficulties. We'll look at those in a second. And it uses this very clunky medieval dream vision sort of format with what are called 14ers. I'll read a couple of them for you in a moment. 14ers are clumsy, clunky, not very artistically pleasing to the ear, but they have one advantage, and that is it's really easy to memorize something in 14er verse, as you'll see in a moment. Wigglesworth's life was quite interesting. He was considered to be a substantial scholar in his time, born in 1631, so he was really considered pretty much a first-generation Puritan. In some of his earlier work as well, other poems outside of this, for example, one of his best is God's Controversy with New England. It was a poem that was occasioned by the big drought that also fell, coincidentally, in the same year as the Halfway Covenant was passed. One of the great lines from that poem, which I had to memorize when I was in graduate school, was, "Beware, O sinful land, beware, and do not think it strange that greater punishments he forgot it. Greater punishments are to come unless thou quickly change." And so it was a very prophetic sort of thing. You can read this and the Day of Doom, and that poem in the Jeremiad strain that we talked about. See Sack von Berkovich, if you will. Well, let's take a look at how it opens, because it's a vision, it's a dream. It's the author, the poet, is dreaming, and he's sharing with you this dream that he had one night. Okay? And it opens, "Still was the night serene and bright when all men sleeping lay. Calm was the season, and carnal reason thought so 'twould last for aye. Soul, take thine ease, let sorrow cease. Much good thou hast in store. This was their song, their cups among the evening before." Now I'm going to exaggerate the verse so you can see it. "Still was the night serene and bright when all men sleeping lay. Calm was the season, and carnal reason, etc., etc." You see how clunky it is and mechanical and sing-songy? That's 14ers. So it opens with, everybody just went to bed like usual. They were all worried about their lives, and they had a good night before, had a good dinner and everything, and nobody really worried about their future, their mortality, etc. But we skip over to stanza 19 as he narrates this, and suddenly the trumpet is blown, and you see in stanza 19, "The same translate from mortal states to immortality, all that survive and be alive in the twinkling of an eye, that so they may abide for aye to endless weal or woe, but the renate and reprobate are made to die no more." Right? So the trumpet is sounded, it's the last day, it's the judgment, and both living and dead are brought up into heaven's judgment seat, all in one. It catches everybody who's alive unaware, right? And so everybody's really freaked out, and so on. First thing that you got to do when you're up in heaven and it's judgment day is separate the sheep from the goats, and that is exactly what Wigglesworth tells us happens in stanzas 21 through 25. He says in 21, "A separation and differing station by Christ appointed is, to sinners sad twixt good and bad, twixt heirs of woe and bliss. At Christ's right hand the sheep do stand, his holy martyrs, who for his dear name suffering shame, calamity, and woe, like champions stood, with their blood and testimony sealed. Next unto them were a room all Christ's afflicted ones, right? The people who suffered for righteousness' sake. And then in stanza 24, aesthetics, people who were involved in self-denial, people who put aside the pleasures of this life for a godly life. But in 25, we see Christ's flock of lambs. There also stands whose faith was weak yet true, right? All the rest of us who aren't heroes. All sound believers, gospel receivers, whose grace was small but grew. And them among an infant throng of babes, for whom Christ died, whom for his own by wages unknown to men he sanctified, right? So there are all those who are sanctified and who weren't very terribly strong Christians, but they made it somehow. And of course, you've got the babies for whom Christ dies. We're going to see this a little bit later on, where you find out that some babies go to hell because Christ didn't die for them. Right? It's a very unusual sentiment to us. Then the goats in stanza 27. At Christ's left hand the goats do stand, all whining hypocrites, who for self-ends did seem Christ's friends, but fostered guileful sprites, meaning spirits, who sheep resembled, but they dissembled, their hearts were not sincere, who once did throng Christ's lambs among, but now must not come near. Apostates and runaways in 28, the godless, apathetic folks in stanza 29, transgressors in 30. You get a whole catalog of goats. I mean, it's all kinds of goats, right? It's type 1.A goats and type B goats and reprobate goats, transgressor goats, and so on and so forth. He uses by the time you get to devils, infidels, heathens, all kinds of things. By the time he gets to 38, he's ready to discuss sort of the doctrine of election. So remember that the poem serves a couple of purposes. One, it's designed as a public poem to get public repentance, to get people on board with the theology of the establishment. To do that, he's got to walk you through sort of a rationale for some of the basic doctrinal beliefs. And one of those, of course, is election. You see that in 38, 40, 43, and 44. All silence keep both goats and sheep before the judge's throne, with mild aspect to his elect, then spake the Holy One. My sheep draw near, your sentence hear, which is to you no dread, who clearly now discern and know your sins are pardoned. Right? Okay, so there you go, right? Pardoned. He chooses whom he wishes to pardon. In stanza 40, these men be those my Father chose before the world's foundation, and to me gave that I should save from death and condemnation. So here's Calvinism, here's doctrine of election, right? Here's predestination. From the beginning of time, he chose them, right? Knowing what they would choose, right? So we get into that when we get into free will and all that kind of stuff. Skipping down to 43, my grace to one is wrong to none. None can election claim. Amongst all those their souls that lose, none can rejection blame. He that may choose or else refuse all men to save or spill, may this man choose and that refuse, redeeming whom he will. This is totally God's prerogative. Don't ask me why. It's presumptuous to ask why. I don't have to save any of you people. No one has a right to be saved. No one has a right to be chosen. No one has a right to the election of God's disposition. In 44, but as for those whom I have chose salvation's heirs to be, I underwent, and I want you to emphasize this, I underwent their punishment, and therefore set them free. I bore their grief and their relief by suffering procured, that they of bliss and happiness might firmly be assured. Right? Now, he doesn't put the emphasis in, I do, but it's not too far off of what he means, right? It's not that Jesus died for everybody. I mean, he died to make it possible for everybody, but he knew that some people wouldn't choose that, right? Wouldn't accept that grace. So here's Doctrine of Election 101 explained by Wigglesworth so that the true believers will follow properly. Okay, a whole multitude of objections by the goats follow. A lot of pleadings. All of these are shot down. A big chunk of these stanzas, one after another, after another, after another. What he's doing is he's equipping true Puritan believers with the arguments necessary to shoot down skeptics of Puritanism, critics of Puritanism. Well, what about these people? What about these people? What about people who didn't know God? What about people who are from distant lands and they never had opportunity to find out about the Bible or Christianity? What about these people over here? And so on and so forth. And so he, one after another, he refutes, and he's doing that to model what you should be arguing when you're faced with, as if you're a Puritan, what you should be arguing if you're a Puritan, in the face of objections to your theology. Well, he goes through a whole long list of this, but it gets exciting now when we get to 144, where he's basically laying out an argument for free will. Then at the bar arraigned are an impudenter sort. Oh, impudenter, more impudent. Impudenter? Okay. Who to evade the guilt that's laid upon them thus retort. How could we cease thus to transgress? How could we hell avoid, whom God's decree shut out from thee, and signed to be destroyed? Wait a minute, I never had a chance to go to heaven because I wasn't of the elect. Then he says, now look, it's not that God made you choose bad. He gave you free will. He just knew what you would choose. But that makes you still responsible for your choice. So he's giving people a way to argue in favor of Calvinism / doctrine of election / Puritan doctrine. This even extends all the way out on stanza 166 to the most famous section of the poem, where he actually defends the notion that some babies will go to hell because Jesus didn't die for some babies. He died for all babies. He only died for some of them. In stanza 166, reprobate infants, an oxymoron for many of us. Reprobate infants. Anyway. Then to the bar all they drew near who died in infancy, and never had, or good or bad, effected personally, but from the womb unto the tomb were straightway carried, or at the last ere they transgressed, who thus began to plead. But look at what he says in 167. But Adam's guilt our souls hath split. His fault is charged on us, and that alone hath overthrown and utterly undone us. Now not we, but he ate of the tree, whose fruit was interdicted. Yet on us all of his sad fall the punishments inflicted. How could we sin that had not been, or how is his sin ours? Without consent, which to prevent we never made a power. You stop right there and you think, that is a really great argument that the babies is making there. What do you mean I inherited sin and I didn't even have a life? I just went out of the womb and straight to hell. What kind of God would do that? Wigglesworth is prepared to defend Calvinist doctrine to the bitter end, and to teach you how to do it too. Then answer the judge most dread, God doth such doom forbid, that men should die eternally for what they never did. But what you call old Adam's fall and only his trespass, you call amiss to call it his, both his and yours it was. That's the best he can do. I don't find it convincing. He then says, he stood and fell, did ill or well, not for himself alone, etc. So you're just guilt by association, guilt by inheritance, essentially, is what he says. That you have free will, but in a way you kind of don't. You figure it out. You decide what you think about it. That's one of the reasons why there probably aren't very many Calvinists anymore, strictly speaking, or at least they're somewhat reformed on that point anyway. Well, let's skip on over and take a quick look at Jonathan Mitchell's ode to Michael Wigglesworth on 412 of your textbook, and it's quite an interesting piece as well. He talks about a verse may find him who a sermon flies, saith Herbert well, great truths to dress in metre becomes a preacher, who men's souls doth prize, that truth in sugar rolled may taste the sweeter. Very much in the Horatian vein, right? Aut prodesse, aut delectare. We spoke about this a little bit in class, or you can look it up a little bit. It's the poet Horace who says great literature should be dressed in pleasing garb, should be pleasing, but also instructional. So Mitchell sort of praises him for not engaging in toys or fables, right? But good, beefy poetry, no fluff. And there's a biblical parallel being drawn here with David, the poet, and says, look, this is perfectly justifiable. Poetry is perfectly okay. David wrote the Psalms after all, and so on. He says, but storms to write most psalms God made him meet. Affection turned his pen to poetry. So it was out of love and out of great talent and so on, but there's no mistaking. Mitchell sees him as engaging in versifying, not for art's sake, but for instruction's sake. And because of that, he finds it much more tolerable, much more orthodox, much more acceptable within the Puritan code.